Today's speaker is Dr. Stan Deaton, who is a nationally recognized public historian. As a multiple Emmy winner, I am tempted to say that he needs no introduction, but it would be a bit unfair to not extol his virtues and accomplishments. I do that because we're not going to give him a lot of money for being here, so I want to do this. Stan is the Dr. Elaine B. Andrews Distinguished Historian at the Georgia Historical Society, where he has worked since 1998. He holds a Ph.D. in history from the University of Florida, back when they were still teaching history. He has a master's in history from the University of Georgia and a bachelor's of arts in journalism from the Grady School, which is a journalism school at the University of Georgia. He is the Emmy-winning writer and host of Today in Georgia History, which is jointly produced for TV and radio by the Georgia Historical Society and Georgia Public Broadcasting, the statewide PBS network. At the Georgia Historical Society, Stan is a public historian, speaker, writer, teacher, and lecturer. He produces videos, writes a blog, and records podcasts that are all available at, here's the reference, Off the Deaton Path. Now, if you put that in Google, you will go to all the fun places, Off the Deaton Path. He serves as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and speaks to groups across the country on a variety of subjects. At the Historical Society, he serves as managing editor for the Georgia Historical Quarterly, recruits materials for the Georgia Historical Society Research Center, leads teacher training workshops, writes historical markers, conducts oral history interviews, helps write grants, assists with fundraising, writes newspaper editorials, and is regularly interviewed by broadcast and print media on a variety of subjects related to history and the news. In short, he does it all. But like the AAHH, he believes that history should be told accurately. And I should add, in today's world, openly, without fear or reservation. Today, Stan is going to talk about why we can't stop talking about race and racism in American history. Following the talk, there will be a moderated Q&A session where you can ask Stan questions on his talk or on other relevant subjects. You can add the process of asking questions. You have two options. One, you can go to questions.chq.org, questions.chq.org, and you can enter your question electronically, or you could do it the old-fashioned way, raise your hand and someone will bring you a sheet of paper and you pray that I can read your question at that point. Also, for those who want to discuss his speech further, there will be a Chautauqua dialogue at 4 p.m. tomorrow at 40 Scott Avenue, the AAHH house, to discuss the impact of his speech upon you. There are lots of Chautauqua dialogues that go on here at the property. Ours is only one of two that is specifically focused on a topic. Again, that topic is, how did the speech you're going to hear today impact you? Or what questions do you have about it? And you can raise that issue tomorrow, 4 p.m. at 40 Scott Avenue. No reservations are needed. We encourage you to join us. Now, at long last, please join me in giving a warm Chautauqua greeting to Dr. Stan Deaton.
Thank you, Errol. Thank you all. This is a return visit for me. I was here in 2019, and I'm going to say the same thing at the beginning that I said then. I'll let you all in on a dirty little secret. In the rest of the world, it's August. I don't know what this is, but it is not August. It was 97 degrees in Savannah this week when I left, so this is like paradise. So I won't tell anybody if you won't. This is This is really fantastic, and I deeply appreciate the opportunity to come back. What a warm welcome I received last time, despite the topic and despite the subject. And I deeply appreciate the invitation to come back up here, weather the pandemic and everything else. So it's a pure joy for me to be here and to see so many faces I recognize and friends who have also up here from Georgia this week. So thank you all very much for the welcome that you have given me. Let's get right to it. This is called Can't We Stop Talking About This? Race in American History. And I'm going to focus on, as you'll see, between the Revolution and the Civil War. So in keeping with the theme of this week, freedom of expression and the resiliency of democracy, we're going to be talking today about talking about race in American history. If you follow the headlines at all, sometimes they land on you. You don't have to follow them. You know that this is a highly contentious and political topic, or it can be. The title of this talk, Can't We Stop Talking About This?, is a phrase, a question, a lament, a plea, a complaint I've often heard, always from people who have grown increasingly wary and weary about talking about something that they think is either overrated or overly divisive or was only a sideline to the theme of freedom, or all of the above. How, they ask, will we ever move on if we don't stop talking about this subject? I've heard it, you've heard it. Racism will only go away, I've been told, if you just stop talking about it. That's what's keeping it going. Well, talking about the racial history of the United States often makes us feel uncomfortable. And I always tell people it should. If it doesn't, you're not listening or you don't have a pulse. It should make us feel uncomfortable. But I hope that we can come to it with an open mind. We hear a lot of talk in this country about condemning the idea that we should talk about race, racism, or our own history as being counterproductive to moving forward as a nation. Let me start out by saying I don't think history is divisive. I think it can be healing if we come to it to learn and to be honest with ourselves about our shared history. I am not here to condemn people in the past, but to understand them. I'm not here to condemn the United States or the people of the past, but to understand its history. Simply condemning and dismissing gets us nowhere. If we don't try to understand the people of the past and how our past relates to our present, as it most assuredly does, if we don't try to understand our history, we can't learn anything from it or from them. And our history, always, I say, does not have to be our destiny. Specifically, I hope to provide a broader and deeper historical context for much of what is happening in our country right now as states and local communities pass laws that forbid the teaching of certain concepts and ideas that have to do with race and history. Georgia, as you probably know, passed a law in the spring of 2022 forbidding the teaching of what is called divisive concepts in schools, whatever those are. My thesis is a very simple one. You will hear it repeated. Despite a constitutional commitment to freedom of speech, Americans have a very long history of stifling public discussions of race in the public arena and pushing back against anything that threatens the racial status quo. Across more than 200 years of history, discussions of race in America have provoked fierce backlash. Congressional gag rules against discussing slavery, bans on abolitionist literature, terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow laws that punished black activism, lynching, white massive resistance that fiercely resisted integration during the civil rights movement, massive resistance fears that equate civil rights leaders with communism, and the current controversies over Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, anti-racism, and anti-racism. As we'll see, there is nothing new about the current debate and the laws resulting from them. Now, I'll focus a great deal of attention on the period immediately following the American Revolution, in part because we know a lot about the antebellum period and the lead up to the Civil War, but the post-revolutionary period is less well known, and it laid the groundwork for much of what followed all the way up to the present day. While the American Revolution forced many Americans to question and ultimately condemn slavery, most white Southerners became convinced that their political and economic prosperity rested more than ever upon slavery's survival and expansion in the region. There have been many moments, like the last 3 years in American history, moments when Americans, galvanized by events, questioned the racial status quo and pushed back actively through words or deeds or both against the establishment and against the dominant racial narrative. In almost every instance, that action has been met with an equal and fiercely resistant reaction, as we will see from the revolution through our own time, when state legislatures, as I said, are passing bills limiting and censoring classroom discussions, and the ongoing and seemingly bottomless controversies out of Florida over the teaching of American history and almost everything else that can be taught. What divisive concepts means, of course, are concepts that make white people feel uncomfortable. There's your definition. Talking about and praising the Confederacy or Confederate History Month is not a divisive concept. Not in Tennessee. Not in a lot of other places. It's an old story in this country and one with deep roots in our national DNA. As often as not, when a riveting event occurs in our country that forces us as a people to stop and collectively take stock of race relations and the racial status quo, from the American Revolution to the Haitian Revolution of 1791, Nat Turner's Rebellion of 1831, the rise of the abolitionist movement, the end of slavery through emancipation, blacks voting and holding office during Reconstruction, desegregation in the middle of the 20th century, the civil rights movement, the election of a black president, the murder of George Floyd. When these events and others like them provided a moment for Americans to question collectively who we are as a people and how far we've come, there has been an equal and forceful counteraction, a reaction, a backlash that sought to use the full power of the state to stifle public discussion, demean and discredit the leaders of those movements, and shut down calls for change. As Eric Foner recently referred to this phenomenon in this way, he said, "In the Newtonian physics of American politics, any action designed to improve the condition of black Americans called forth an equal and opposite reaction." What I want to do today is provide some historical context for the events that we've been living through the last 3 years since the death of George Floyd brought public protest, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and the fierce backlash that always brings the past jarringly into the present, because the past and the present are intimately linked. We're talking about this not just because it's interesting and provides insight into the problems we still face, but also because I think it's imperative to think about the events in our own day in a larger and perhaps different context, to spark conversations, to think about how we can collectively move forward, not by censoring and whitewashing the past, and by asking questions like, can't we just stop talking about it? But in fact, by being honest about our history. So let's start with the American Revolution. From the very moment of American nationhood, we have to come to grips with the fact that the man who wrote "All men are created equal" owned hundreds of human beings. And thus we immediately come face to face with what historians have called the American paradox. From the moment our nation was born, slavery and freedom were locked in struggle. Slavery was not an aberration, an abnormal deviation from freedom, a sideline. It was, in fact, indispensable to the creation of a free country, and that is what makes it so hard to figure out. British writer Samuel Johnson summed it up in one question in 1776, and I quote, "How is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" It has become for many people the paradox that bothers us almost to the point of distraction, that the author of the Declaration of Independence was also one of the largest slaveholders of his time, as were many of the others who have been so long revered as founding fathers. Some have tried to mitigate it, explain it, apologize for it, everything they can think of except face it squarely and try to figure out what it means. Because this, I would argue, is at the heart of the American experience, and we cannot move forward until we come to grips with it. The philosophical passage of the Declaration, which Jefferson wrote as a single brief paragraph, became the most famous part of the document, and as a summary of human rights and as a justification of revolution on behalf of human rights, it has never been excelled. You all know it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Has anything ever been written that is simultaneously so inspiring, so revolutionary, so hypocritical for the generation that wrote it? so dangerous to those who would still deny it. Americans didn't agree then and have disagreed ever since over what Jefferson meant by those words and who was included. Here is the American paradox written out for all the world to see, the standard by which we have measured ourselves ever since. We cannot escape the fact that Jefferson assaulted the notion that had governed mankind since the dawn of time, that a natural inequality existed among humans, which meant that some men and women would always be there to serve a favored few. That's the way it had always been. Americans continue to grapple with the notion that all people are created equal. We still cannot agree on just what is and is not an inalienable right. But here in the Declaration is the very essence of what it means to be an American. If you accept the creed of the Declaration and you become a citizen, then you're an American. If other countries were founded on tribal identities or language or ethnicity or religion or somehow formed long ago in the mists of time, we know that this country was founded on an idea, and we know the very place and the afternoon that it began. And we've been grappling ever since with the fact that the man who scratched out those words on a piece of parchment in a small room on Market Street in Philadelphia owned hundreds of other human beings and engaged in one of the most dehumanizing and degrading institutions ever. This is the crux of American history, and this, to me, is what separates our history from all others. This paradox was there at the creation, and there is no understanding our history or who we are as a people without coming to terms with it. The truth is, the generation that created what is now the United States, that fought the war that separated us from the British Empire and monarchy, and that led the new republic in the last years of the 18th and the early years of the 19th century, was dominated and led by white privileged males who firmly believed in the institution of human slavery. I said it out loud. Acknowledging that does not mean that we hate our country or that we are communist or socialist or weak or woke. I think that that kind of self-reflective honesty is what separates this self-governing republic from every other country in the world. We can also, at the same time, acknowledge that the inspiring words used to justify that revolution set in motion a commitment to human rights that was unique, and that's much of the course of the rest of our history. It still exists. It's still fought over, still contested, still ongoing, and is a complex part of who we are as a nation and as a people. I think that we can take a page from Jefferson's own words, and I quote him here. "Here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it." As a mature nation of self-governing individuals dedicated to our continued existence as a constitutional republic, we can and should be transparent about our past, honest with ourselves, and in doing so, we will be stronger and better for it. Slavery, thank you. Slavery flourished before the American Revolution as a decidedly American institution, not just a Southern one, as you probably know. As noted, this irony has led subsequent generations of Americans to condemn the moral hypocrisy of their revolutionary forebears who sought political freedom from Great Britain while simultaneously denying liberty to thousands of black men and women. But the important distinction to make here is that the revolution was a moment of reckoning. As the historian Joseph Ellis has recently pointed out, quote, "No prominent member of the revolutionary generation, to include slave owners south of the Potomac, ever attempted to argue that slavery was morally compatible with the values of the Declaration of Independence. The only question," he said, "was how to end it," unquote. For many of them, they believed that slavery was an anachronism, a doomed institution in the modern world, and that it was destined to end, and probably in the not-so-distant future. So why then didn't slavery end everywhere after the American Revolution? It was, in fact, questioned everywhere, and in some places, it ended altogether. Anti-slavery sentiment swept through many states during and after the Revolution. Vermont in 1777, New Hampshire in 1779 made slavery illegal in their state constitutions. The Massachusetts court followed in 1783. Pennsylvania, 1780, and Rhode Island in 1784 passed laws ending slavery within their borders. Connecticut adopted a gradual emancipation plan in 1784. As Joyce Appleby points out, these were the first legislative acts abolishing slavery in the history of the world. I might pause here and point out, by the way, that these laws prove that when we hold people in the 18th century accountable for slavery, we are not, in fact, judging them by the standards of our own time. Many people then thought slavery was morally incompatible with freedom, and they acted on it. But why didn't the American South? It is certainly true that the upheavals of war in the southern states, that is, in this case, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and the British occupation of Charleston and Savannah profoundly challenged the institution of slavery in those states and further unwound the already tenuous bonds of white authority there. It's important to remember that slavery as an institution was always fluid. It was different in different places. It was never static and unchanging. Even in the colonial period, before the Revolution in Charleston, which was the fourth largest city in America during the colonial period, where over 16,000 people occupied the space of a few square miles, half the population enslaved, residential segregation unknown, white and black intermingled constantly. Urban life, with its increased economic and social opportunities, allowed Charleston's large enslaved population a greater degree of autonomy than almost anywhere else in America. This does not mean they were getting free job training or that they were treated nicely. It means that urban slavery was different from rural slavery or plantation slavery. Even before the chaos of the Revolutionary War, the structure of slavery in pre-war Charleston was fluid. Black Charlestonians constantly carried out individual acts of rebellion, and whites tolerated them largely because they had to. They had no choice if society was going to function in any coherent, normative way. One visitor complained in 1772 that most blacks in Charleston refused to take off their hats to whites in the city streets. Another noted clear differences between the enslaved in the country and city. Someone identifying themselves as a stranger complained in the newspaper that while enslaved people in the country wore clothes that they said was suitable to their condition and appeared contented, sober, modest, humble, civil, and obliging, Charleston's blacks behaved in all respects the very reverse, quoting, abandonedly rude, unmannerly, insolent, and shameless. Note here that manners of behavior and dress could be considered divisive and disruptive, even rebellious, a theme that we'll see again and again. The Revolutionary War had an enormous impact on the institution of slavery in the South. War always shakes the foundation of society, and in urban places first, and the American Revolution was no different. Philip Morgan estimates that between 25,000 enslaved South Carolinians either ran away or joined the British during the years of war and occupation. This loss represented 25%, 1/4 of the pre-war enslaved population. The Revolution proved to be an enormous challenge for the institution of slavery everywhere in America. As a result, white Southerners increasingly viewed their enslaved population as potential incendiaries whom they could neither trust nor live without. It was, as Thomas Jefferson famously said, like having the wolf by the ears. You can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Caught on the horns of this enormous dilemma, the white South after the Revolution began increasingly closing itself off ideologically from the rest of the world. The spirit of the American Revolution would increasingly find itself fighting for survival in an atmosphere of paranoia, suspicion, and fear and resentment. As we will see, the seeds of what the South would become in the 19th century, and in many ways what America has become since, took deep root in the last years of the 18th century. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, white Southerners and Northerners had to compromise on slavery. Southerners had to agree to the end of the international slave trade in 20 years in 1808, and Northerners agreed that enslaved people would actually be represented by white people in the national legislature in the 3/5 clause. No white Southerners, however, thought the federal government created by that Constitution had a right to tamper with property in human beings. Southerners might make concessions over the slave trade in order to ensure the survival of the Union, but they drew a hard and non-negotiable line in the sand over any further interference. Federal legislation concerning slavery in the territories would be one thing. Attempting to end slavery in the existing states was something else entirely. In February 1790, as the new government, less than a year old by then, struggled to establish its authority, 3 Quaker petitions asking Congress to abolish slavery and the slave trade ignited a firestorm of controversy and raised Southern tempers in Congress to a fever pitch. Thomas Fitzsimmons of Pennsylvania introduced a petition from Quaker groups in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, while John Lawrence introduced a similar petition from New York Quakers. The next day, the Congress received a petition signed by Benjamin Franklin from the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery, which threatened, quote, to use all justifiable endeavors to loosen the bands of slavery and promote a general enjoyment of the blessings of freedom, unquote. The South Carolina delegation exploded in outrage. Charleston Congressman William Lawton Smith and his colleague A. Danis Burke blasted the Quakers, many of whom were sitting in the gallery, for trying to incite a bloody insurrection and asked that the petitions be thrown out and altogether done away with, since the request, they said, was clearly unconstitutional. Despite strong Southern protests, Congress referred the petitions to a committee, and the debate and the argument began in earnest. South Carolina's attack on these Quaker petitions in the congressional debates of 1790 rehearsed practically every defense of slavery that Southerners would ever make in the 18th and 19th century. Many white Southerners who otherwise didn't agree on anything politically united to defend slavery, not as some necessary evil that had been foisted upon them by previous generations that needed apology, but as a humane and uplifting institution. The 3 South Carolina congressmen directed their most heated invective against federal interference with slavery and at the Quakers themselves. South Carolinians, William Lawton Smith said, considered the subject closed after adjournment of the Constitutional Convention. The Union, he said, resembled a marriage, each side compromising and accepting the other's faults. He said, the northern states adopted us with our slaves, and we adopted them with their Quakers. Furthermore, he said, the marriage was a political union, not a moral one, he said, and I don't think my constituents want to learn morals from Quakers. Meanwhile, another asked incredulously if the Quakers really expected Carolinians to free their slaves. It would never happen, he said, without a civil war. Southerners in Congress made it clear that they would oppose violently even the slightest interference with what they called our Negro property. They triumphed in this case over the issue of Congress's authority to interfere with slavery in the states. But the white South emerged from these debates more anxious than ever over the growing necessity to defend slavery in the face of external or internal aggression. Charles Coatsworth Pinckney of Charleston spoke for many when he told Congressman Thomas Sumter that though he had supported the new federal government to this point, he said, I have no idea of them intermeddling with our Negroes. That is altogether a matter of domestic regulation. Here we see in the foundation in 1790 for white Southerners' response to abolition in the 1830s, to the anti-slavery agitation in the decades leading up to the Civil War, to black people holding office and voting during Reconstruction, and the foundation for Southern stonewalling and filibustering of all civil rights legislation in the 20th century, all the way up to our present day. It seems that the existence of slavery was not the problem. People who criticized slavery were the problem. Can't we just stop talking about this? The slavery question in the Young Republic was the original divisive concept. The slave revolt on the French West Indian island of Santo Domingo, Haiti, in 1791 that established the first country to be founded by formerly enslaved people terrified white America and permanently altered the South's intellectual climate. It became for many the equivalent of what Jefferson later called the fire bell in the night. Though Northern abolitionists might be cause for alarm, they paled in significance when compared to the anxiety and the threat posed by what had happened in Haiti. However open and cosmopolitan Charleston and other cities may have been in the colonial era and even in the immediate post-war years, the character of the city changed perceptibly in the 1790s after the successful enslaved revolt in Haiti. Charleston whites, already anxious, as I mentioned, over the continuing attacks upon slavery in their own country, became convinced by Haiti that a similar volcano stirred beneath them and that only extraordinary measures could prevent a similar explosion. After 1791, white Charlestonians began constructing an intellectual blockade against any influence whether external or internal, that might ignite the fuse of insurrection. Haiti became the lens through which whites viewed every facet of slavery and black life in the American South. In white minds, all free blacks, particularly those from the West Indies, were potential incendiaries who should be driven from the state. The reaction was immediate. Lawmakers banned all enslaved people from the West Indies for fear that they especially might be carriers of the dreaded virus of insurrection. Nervous officials outlawed all large gatherings of the city's enslaved population. Blacks gathering to worship or socialize, even in small numbers, became illegal. Newspapers stopped printing anti-slavery letters, while abolitionist literature provoked fierce backlash. One writer even proposed that the local press stop publishing any news about Haiti, lest clever slaves, as he put it, explain to the more ignorant of their class the full force of this dangerous doctrine. Public opinion and fear banished all forms of dissent and debate. And during the 1790s, the walls of paranoia began to go up. Not for the last time, the white backlash was fierce. The Newtonian physics of American politics was in full force. South Carolinians, like most Americans, initially welcomed and supported news of the French Revolution in 1789. Enthusiasm, however, turned to outright horror when the French abolished slavery throughout their empire in 1793. White refugees from Haiti poured into Charleston that same year, and white Charlestonians began to witness firsthand the realities of enslaved rebellion. Many white leaders in Charleston had been suspicious from the start. Words like égalité and liberté frightened them. South Carolina would be one of the first victims to the principles contained in the rights of man, one planner warned, because he realized that such notions could be applied, as he put it, without distinction to all persons of all colors. To make matters worse, Northern abolition societies chose the Haitian Revolution as the occasion for a renewed call for a general emancipation of all American slaves. On the first day of January 1794, an abolition convention in Philadelphia encouraged the formation of societies in every state to work toward abolishing both the slave trade and domestic slavery. They argued that what happened in Haiti was the natural result of a system inconsistent with liberty and repugnant, they said, to the principles of Christianity. Abolitionist Samuel Hopkins charged that, quote, those who have encouraged, prosecuted, or supported this traffic in their fellow man have been the emissaries of Satan. In a May 1793 address before the Providence Society for Abolishing the Slave Trade, he denounced slave owners as cruel, inhuman, unfeeling brutes, quote, a nuisance and a burden to the earth. He blasted the hypocritical behavior of people calling themselves Christians while doing what he called the work of the devil. He vowed that he and his followers would ardently pursue every active measure to abolish the trade and put an end to slavery, and that ultimately, he said, we will win. One can imagine the effect such a harangue had upon white Southerners still reeling from news from Haiti. Such attacks fed the growing sense of paranoia and hysteria and resentment that they increasingly felt. So in the years after the American Revolution, slavery was transformed from a widespread American institution to an increasingly Southern one. In the 1780s, in fact, editorials actually appeared in Charleston newspapers, questioning the morality of both slavery and the trade. By 1800, the communal white mindset regarding slavery wouldn't tolerate even private ownership of abolitionist literature. By 1800, many white Americans would not hesitate to trample underfoot the twin pillars of freedom of conscience and freedom of the press when either threatened to disturb the growing power of slavery. Public dissent in some places over slavery was no longer an option. That position would only harden in the years to come. As we can see, shutting down the dissemination of ideas about race that make people uncomfortable has a long history. Fast forward to 1831, a watershed year in the history of race in America. Two defining events that year would put slavery and abolition center stage in American political life, and there they would remain for the next 30 years and beyond. January 1st, 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist in Massachusetts, began publishing The Liberator, a newspaper. With its first words, he made clear that he was no moderate abolitionist, content to mildly protest until slave owners decided to end the institution on their own. He called for the immediate end to slavery and declared, quote, I am in earnest I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. He would have loved social media. He believed that slavery was a national sin and that the Constitution, which sanctioned slavery, was a compact with the devil. Many Southerners considered Garrison and his kind nothing less than incendiary traitors who were out to foment slave rebellion and race war. On August 21st, 1831, their prophecies seemed to come true. That night, an enslaved man in Southampton County, Virginia, began the only effective, sustained enslaved rebellion in U.S. history. Nat Turner was a 30-year-old enslaved man who had learned to read from one of his owner's sons, and he was intensely religious. He believed that he was called upon by God to lead his people out of bondage, earning the nickname the Prophet. He began his campaign on the night of August 21st, following an eclipse that he took as a sign, and with 7 enslaved followers that soon grew to 75, Turner launched a campaign that over a couple of days ended with 60 whites dead, many of them hacked to pieces. To say that it alarmed the white population would be an understatement. This was their ultimate worst nightmare come true. Electric as September 11th, or one of the mass shootings we've endured in our own time, and its impact. And whites feared it was the beginning of a massive enslaved uprising that might drench the country in blood. The state of Virginia brought overwhelming force against Turner and his followers, as you can imagine, and an intense manhunt finally captured him. He was not lynched, he was tried and executed. Nat Turner's rebellion became legendary and destroyed the white Southern myth that the enslaved were either content to be slaves or too docile to mount an insurrection. And above all, they blamed the insurrection not on the institution of slavery, not on the cruelty inherent in that institution, but on the fact that Turner could read, and on the abolitionists, who by their very existence they thought created people like Nat Turner. Again, as was so often happen afterwards, as whites saw it, the real problem was not the existence of slavery, but the existence of people who questioned slavery. So in the aftermath of that rebellion in Virginia, state legislators there convened and considered a raft of reforms to the system, including the ultimate reform, ending slavery in Virginia altogether. But that was never going to happen, and it never got off the ground. But they did talk about it, however briefly. But in the end, you'll be shocked to hear this, pro-slavery diehards defeated every single anti-slavery measure and ended up pushing through an even more restrictive slave code than the one that had been in place before. Turner's uprising had so frightened them that it set off a wave of legislation across the South, prohibiting the education of black people, prohibiting their movements, prohibiting them from gathering in large numbers, again and again and again. Whenever black Americans and their allies challenged the status quo, whites pushed back hard. Defenders of slavery doubled down. Determined not to apologize or pass any laws to change it, they instead insisted that slavery had no undesirable aspects at all. They trotted out the idea that had first gained life in the 1790s and clung to it with ferocious tenacity. Slavery, in fact, was a positive good that had to be defended at all costs. And they hated abolitionists and those who espoused freedom with a passion and reacted violently to the loudest of them. In October 1831, 2 months after Nat Turner's rebellion, Georgia offered a $4,000 reward for anyone who could bring William Lloyd Garrison to the state for trial. The war of words became so bitter and the atmosphere so poisoned that free speech and free inquiry disappeared. People who disagreed with the pro-slavery status quo were forced out. Anti-slavery preachers silenced. The Vigilance Committee of South Carolina offered $1,500 for the arrest of any person distributing abolitionist literature. Censorship campaigns reached a fever pitch. Pro-slavery whites were determined to keep abolitionist literature out of their communities by force if necessary. Southern states passed laws making it illegal for American citizens to receive abolitionist literature through the mail. I think a precursor to the current debate about receiving abortion pills through the mail. We have been there before. Here was an idea so dangerous that you couldn't even read about it in the comfort of your own home, much less talk about it or advocate for it. They worked up popular resentment to such a pitch that people took matters into their own hands. In July 1835, a group broke into the Charleston post office, scrutinized and seized anti-slavery newspapers, and made a bonfire of them in the public square. This happened in cities all over the South. Southern postmasters took it upon themselves to take abolitionist literature out of the mails. Here was censorship indeed. Anyone who questioned the pro-slavery status quo did so at the risk of their lives. A white man in Petersburg, Virginia, was publicly whipped and ordered to leave for suggesting, quote, black men might have, in the abstract, a right to freedom. A Georgian who subscribed to the Liberator was dragged from his home by a mob, tarred and feathered, set afire, ducked in the river, and then tied to a post and whipped, all for receiving a newspaper. All over the South during this period, pro-slavery leaders led a violent backlash against any ideas that challenged the racial status quo, including burning books, banning books and newspapers, encouraging neighbors to spy on and report on neighbors, much as some groups are encouraging parents to turn in teachers that they think are teaching divisive concepts. And this was not just happening on the state level. Pro-slavery forces in Congress shut down any debate over slavery there with a series of infamous gag rules that tabled without discussion any petition received regarding slavery. In 1834, the American Anti-Slavery Society began an anti-slavery petition drive. Over the next few years, Congress became inundated with anti-slavery petitions. In 1837-38, for example, abolitionists sent more than 130,000 petitions to Congress asking for the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. You can imagine the white pro-slavery response. In May 1836, the House passed a resolution that automatically tabled or postponed action on all petitions relating to slavery without hearing them. Stricter versions of this gag rule passed every succeeding Congress. And at first, only a small group opposed the rule, led by Representative and former President John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. Gradually, anti-slavery sentiment grew. More Northern congressmen supported Adams' argument that whatever one's views on slavery, stifling the right to petition was unconstitutional. For the next few Congresses, Adams fought against the gag rule, declaring it a restriction on free speech. Despite his efforts, the House successfully passed and reintroduced in each house another gag rule until Adams finally mustered enough votes to overturn it in 1844, a harbinger of how bitterly divided the sections were becoming over the institution of slavery and the lengths to which white conservatives would go to strangle even talking about it. During the Civil War, and I'll skip the 1850s, we all know too well how slavery became the centerpiece of American political life. As the institution of slavery unraveled during the Civil War, black Americans literally took their freedom into their own hands and feet, running away, walking away, otherwise demonstrating their own autonomy in ways that always made their white owners extremely uncomfortable. Just as the Observer we quoted from the Revolutionary period witnessed firsthand, black historical actors could shake the foundation of white society simply by wearing clothes a different way or speaking their minds freely. The situation became so disturbing to white Georgians that during the Civil War, a bill was introduced in the state legislature that, quote, threatened to punish slaves and free persons of color for abusive and insulting language to white people. Who knew what that was? That could be anything. But punish them for speech. Freedom, it seems, was another divisive concept that the Georgia legislature has dealt with. The Civil War, of course, ended slavery, an event commemorated by Juneteenth, our newest federal holiday. The end of slavery was another moment of our history that should have brought a reckoning with the issue of race. Did it? You know the answer to that. Instead of working to create a truly equal biracial society after the Civil War, many white Americans, in fact, worked tirelessly, unceasingly to prohibit it. For the next 100 years, through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, lynching, segregation, many white Americans tried to recreate as closely as possible slavery in all but name, denying millions of their fellow Americans any semblance of equality in American civil, political, judicial, and economic society. Had they spent 1/10 of that energy tearing down white supremacy instead of reinforcing it, the civil rights movement might have been unnecessary 100 years later. White supremacy was instead maintained by law, custom, and force through any means necessary until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And still, those who pushed back against it, that is, all of the segregation, the civil rights leaders and their allies, denigrated as communist and socialist, enemies of America, domestic terrorists who led rabble-rousers to burn down cities and destroy property. If you've been paying attention over the last 3 years, you've heard those same phrases again. Those who today are quick to point to Dr. King's statement that people should be judged by their character and not the color of their skin would have been no fans of sit-ins, marches, or boycotts. Of that I am convinced. We hear much of the same complaints today against those in the Black Lives Matter movement or those who protest against laws that prohibit teaching certain aspects of American history in public schools. The communists, socialists, or you hate America, don't you? Once again, the problem isn't racism. It's those who point it out or question it in ways that white people find disturbing. As the United States approaches its 250th anniversary as an independent and mature nation, America, as you know, is once again grappling very publicly with difficult and tangled questions of race, of who we are as a country, what our history is, and what it means, and how it should be taught. But we cannot hide from difficult or troubling history, nor should we. The American nation, as I said, that marched forth from 1776, did so with both freedom and slavery locked hand in hand as essential components of the American experience. Until we can understand how and why that happened and the impact that history continues to exert on us to the present day, we can never truly understand this great country of ours. America's story since that time has been the story of freedom. Who would have it? Who would be allowed to take part in this great experiment of self-government? The history of slavery, the war that ended slavery, the white reaction to the end of slavery through Jim Crow, the Lost Cause, Confederate monuments, lynching, and the Civil Rights Movement, on through to Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, to current controversies over teaching American history. These are not sidebars to the story of American freedom. They are foundational to it, as are all the other great ongoing social revolutions in this country. The American story is unique. It is fascinating. It is deeply inspiring, and it is deeply disturbing. All at the same time. It is complex, and that's okay. We shouldn't shy away from that. We are not a nation of children. We cannot ignore our past or deny that it's relevant or stop talking about it because it makes some people uncomfortable. If the people of the past could live through these events and survive them, surely we can at least learn about them. What a luxury it is for us to be made uncomfortable by our history rather than having to actually live through it. A self-governing republic ought to be able to face its history squarely and truthfully. James Madison said, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors should arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives." Let's leave it to other countries to whitewash and censor their past. We are and have always been stronger than that. Here in this country, if this great experiment in freedom and democracy is to go on, then to the dead and to the living and to those yet to come, all of them, we owe the truth. Thank you very much.
Stan, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
For those outstanding remarks. It did give people some time to come up with some really difficult questions. So let me go right to them. During the creation of the Declaration of Independence, weren't many northern businesses against ending slavery because of the money they made from the triangle trade?
Yes. That is correct. Yes, as I pointed out, it was certainly an American institution with wide tentacles everywhere. And I shouldn't imply that it went peacefully. It did go peacefully, but that it didn't go without opposition, even in places where it ended. Absolutely.
Here is another easy question. What can be done in Florida today? And let me combine that with another question that says, can the study of American history in Florida survive Ron DeSantis? Are we witnessing the specter of fascism? Noting that the Georgia Historical Society, of course, is a non-political organization.
Thank you. I have no answer to that question. Can we survive? Yes. Yeah. I hope that whatever else you heard here today, this country has been through some incredibly horrific events, very difficult times, not unlike our own. And that's the point I'm trying to make, I think, that these kind of discussions have always made people violently angry. and have done any number of things that are unconstitutional to shut them down. That should give us hope. It should give us courage. And I think it should also give us a warning in the sense that these kinds of things are never easy. They won't be easy in Florida. They won't be easy anywhere. I don't know what the answer is there other than the vote, as it always is. But that will be up to the people of Florida, I guess, to decide what kind of government they want to have.
I was raised in a small Pennsylvania steel town in the 1950s. Whites were told that we were victims of Southern blacks who had come together to steal our jobs. Today, working class whites say they are victims and suffer far more racial discrimination than African Americans ever did. I didn't write this. Yeah. Has anything changed?
Nope. No, and I think that is an excellent point, right? This was the whole thing about abolition, that Southerners also, and not just Southerners, they had a lot of allies in other places outside the South. That was always the question, right? Abolition it would be bad for white people. It will be bad for white people. It will cause all kinds of economic and social problems, particularly social problems, but economic as well. And during Reconstruction and every point since then, that argument has been made continuously, yeah.
Are there other nations that have reckoned with their history better and in ways we can learn from them?
Boy, that's a good question. There's certainly other nations who are reckoning with their history. Everybody points to Germany because the Allies sort of forced Germany, with the back of the neck, like, you're going to look at this and you're going to do something about it. And depending on who you talk to, they have done a tremendous job of at least reckoning with. Charleston, I pointed this out in another talk that I give. Charleston has, I don't mean to pick on poor Charleston, Charleston has a Holocaust memorial, but they don't have one to slavery. And I said, imagine the historical sleight of hand. What would the rest of the world say if Germans had erected a monument to black people in the American South, but overlooked the Holocaust that happened right at their own, So I think it's easier to look at other people. Great Britain is going through a reckoning right now. I think a lot of places are, particularly over the last 3 years. We saw a moment where statues were coming down everywhere and names were coming off of things. I don't know if that's the same thing as reckoning with your past. I'm not sure that it is. But certainly other countries have tried to deal with this. There are a lot of others that I'm not even thinking of or talking about right now. Germany has had a hard time with it. They've done it. Japan has not done it. I think they've not even tried, really. And that has caused a lot of conflict with the neighbors. And so I think this is not a uniquely American problem. It's so unique to me right now, I think, because I'm not sure we thought we would ever see this kind of thing again. I think that's what's been so jarring about some of it.
So, is the right question not why can't we stop talking about race, but why do we struggle so mightily to talk about our racist past honestly and to address the wounds created?
It's a great question. There's never been a moment. There was never a moment. I'm just now. I'm in the moment reading a big multi-volume history of the Civil War, and it is always amazing to me that the one thing that Americans did talk about, even while the war was going on, was a plan of gradual emancipation in which the enslavers would be compensated, but not those who had been enslaved, who had done all this labor and lost out on all this money for all these years. That was never on the table. And when it was ever brought up afterwards, it's sort of like, we can't give people things. White people have been given land for centuries before then. And so there's never been a moment at which there's been a national conversation. There wasn't in the civil rights moment. It's like, all right, let's get on with it. Because once again, it's that whole thing about having to own up to something. People have a real hard time talking about things that happened a long time ago, in part because they feel like you're blaming them. Don't blame me. I never owned slaves. I've heard that 150 times if I've ever heard it once. I'm not blaming you. But since you're not responsible for it, it shouldn't be hard for you to talk about. And understand that it still has a tremendous impact on our society today. That is where I think public historians have a job to do. But it's difficult. We see that. Even in great moments, this is the point I want. Even in moments of great crisis where everybody, there's Nat Turner, everybody should, maybe we're not doing this right. There's always a reaction, always a reaction, always a reaction. You can expect it.
Preachers have said that we need less words and more warriors. How do we get more people to be warriors? I'm just reading. Okay?
I know. Yeah, and I'm just standing here. Well, that's up to each individual. I think there are a lot of warriors. I think that's why books have been banned and things have been censored and gagged. I think what we need are people who are willing to stand up to that and say, if you don't want somebody to read a book, if you don't want your children to read that book, don't let them. I said this yesterday, but, taking away someone else's ability to read is not freedom. It is not freedom. I don't care how you capture it. This happened in the 1930s. A lot of people wanted to take Mein Kampf off bookshelves. And there were people who said, this man has come to power and he has ideas about what he wants to do. And your being able to read about what his ideas are is essential to freedom and continuation of democracy. I still believe that. Are some things age inappropriate? Of course, but you as a parent need to decide to keep that out of your children's hands. You don't need to decide to keep it out of other children's hands. That, I think, is the job of other parents. I mean, I think I started the last talk when I was here quoting that guy from in the movie 1776. I've never seen an idea that was so dangerous it couldn't even be talked about. Hell yeah, I'm for debating. So let's talk about it.
Well, we have far more questions than we do time. Let me again thank you, and I'm going to end on a last question, which is a very personal question. And what is it like being a white guy in Savannah with this as your subject?
Well, I'll go to bat for Savannah and say there are a lot of people in Savannah who feel exactly like I do. And there's a lot of people all over the South and this country who feel exactly like I do. I think that I am not saying that my way to think about the past is the only way. I am simply trying to say that a free and fair discussion of our history should include all of it. Yep, it is going to make some people uncomfortable, and whatever you teach in school, of course, should be age appropriate, but don't shut it down. And I think that it shocks a lot of people to hear a white person come out of the Deep South and say these things, but it shouldn't. We have books there too. We have university libraries there too. And we of all people should deeply, deeply understand where this leads. Much of what I've told you is in my own DNA. And so I think we of all people should know the darker side of all of this and should know better, I think, than to go marching backward with banners flying. Sorry, there you go.
Again, if you wish to discuss these subjects further, there is a Chautauqua dialogue tomorrow at 4 p.m. at 40 Scott Avenue. You do not need a reservation. Please feel free. I apologize to those for whom I couldn't answer or raise all of their questions. Thank you all for coming, and let's give Stan one more arousing round of applause. Thank you.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.